Welcome to the Unique Paradigms podcast. Thank you for joining me in our discussion. Our previous podcast episode discussed Indian Diaspora as it relates to the Caribbean and Guyana specifically. The patterns of diaspora can be studied across many races and cultures, but I have chosen to highlight this scholarly area to enhance our discussion topics, support our collective effort, and expand our lens of identity development. It does bring more attention to diasporic relationships as we navigate the global landscape and support transnational solidarity. Coming from an ancestry so deeply connected to indentured servitude inspires me to spend more time connecting with our community, promoting inclusion and solidarity in and among our Caribbean countries as well as South Asian communities. The Indian diasporic population overall is well over 12.5 billion people. The diaspora continues as we collectively influence multiple industries globally today. So I am deeply honored to have all of your support as we embark on this journey of discovery for some, discourse, and an analysis of our intergenerational transmission. An area that I speak of often from personal perspective is encouraging the inclusion of the lens of diasporic populations in these discussions. Personal stories are given importance when we consider the connection to national stories. Family history research also encounters challenges when we consider what we count as history. But it does open our discourse to include other forms of research, perspectives, and other various narratives. Moving forward, collaborations between academic historians and family history researchers has the potential to enable new forms of historical work and national memories that can yet to be produced. But we do bring forth a unique perspective, and in some cases a closer connection to our ancestral practices. The connection to history for some can also be fulfilling in terms of connecting paradigms, behaviors, and personal identity development. For me, it was celebrating my Madrasi traditions, Hindu practices, exploring diasporic contexts, addressing stigmas, and understanding correlations that would influence the development of people, processes, leadership, and our community. In the context of Sanatan Dharma, we can see similarities of puja rituals and worship practices throughout Indian diasporic populations. As a scholar, I also seek to compare and assess stigmas that influence the perception of culture. In my own lens, we'll embark on a journey where we explore layers of ancestral connections and gaps that still exist. The exploration of family as a site for collective memory has changed national histories for centuries. And also looking at family dimensions of memory work in our scholarly community has yet to be expanded. When we look at memories and how they're formed, there are various social levels involved in that. We often intersect and inform one another through our social discourse. Although we do not have many scholars engaging in this inclusiveness, I do seek to contribute and provide a diverse viewpoint, engage our community, and help inform our processes where we can support the retention of our family history. Historians have also been quick to point out that genealogy isn't a new perspective to the present generation, and our families have deployed a wide range of ways to record family lineages and stories to make sure that traditions have survived over time. But the motivations for such actions, they also can vary. And when we think about the remembrances of different families and their place in history, we do see that a lot of our barriers in identity construction could be that there are implications of how those stories are told. When we think about other influences, other relations that affect the resilience of those traditions as well. When we think about an Indian diasporic population, such as in the Caribbean countries like Suriname, also other diasporic populations across the world, in Fiji, South Africa, Mauritius, they still experience influences from colonization. So these do impact the sharing and the storytelling that occurs between generations. In Guyana, the Indian population is a result of early colonizers, such as the British and the Dutch, who were brought as indentured servants. Although known for British presence, there are also heavy influences of the Dutch in Guyana. Prior to the massive arrival of indentured servants from the Whitby and Hesperus in Guyana in 1638, the Dutch were the first Europeans to settle on what is now Guyana. And particularly, we do find archivals in 1616 where the Dutch established the first European settlement in the area of Guyana. So often we found trading posts kilometers upstream by the Essequibo River. Other settlements followed. I was born in Firish Village in Berbice, Guyana, which was also heavily influenced by the Dutch. Most settlements were usually a few kilometers from large rivers, so the presence of agriculture and finding ways to produce crops really influenced the growing importance of agriculture in the country. And as agriculture productivity of Dutch colonies increased, there was a labor shortage that emerged. So initially, indigenous populations were poorly adapted for the work on plantations. Many of them died from diseases introduced by Europeans. The Dutch West India Company turned the importation of African slaves, and they became a key element to the colonial economy. By the 1660s, the slave population numbered about 2,500. The number of indigenous people was estimated at 50,000, and most of them had retreated. Although African slaves were considered an essential element to the economy, their working conditions were brutal. Mortality rates were high. And also, miserable conditions empowered slaves to later rebel and reach emancipation from the British Caribbean in 1834. The integration of indentured servitude and the Indian diaspora is significantly recorded from the port of Tamil in 1838. As scholarly work on intergenerational transfers emphasizes, family stories are not just a linear form of information. They often require the reconstruction of information across our generations, and this is much needed discourse. And when we think about the different generations and their different views over time, we can also think of the exclusions in some of these narratives, the audiences also, the context of these stories. So we find that there are different forms of the way the stories are told. So often we find family secrets are significant to these discussions, as forms of knowledge are often withheld or shared in confidence. But the context does have implications for evolving family memory, as well as our individual identities. I have made connections in our community from our Madrasi traditions, as they've remained resilient despite the stigmatization through the decades. As a community, we were highly reliant on intergenerational transmission of religious practices and cultural traditions. At that time, in 1838, Tamil Nadu was undergoing massive massacres of Hindus and forced conversions into Christianity. There was caste repression, and economics may have influenced the desire for entry into these indentured contracts. Although there is also evidence of North Indian counterparts and also different forms of goddess worship in British colonies, there has been a formation of stigmatization of Madrasi Hindus that dates as far back as those British colonies. So during Indian national independence movements, Hindu reformists also sought to institutionalize Orthodox Hinduism in British colonies and also made attempts to purge other aspects of Sonic practices that were associated with Madrasi religious practices. So we found patterns where there were just stigmas that developed over time. Also, they were seen similar as Afro-Caribbean religious practices. So there was a resilience in those stigmas that also transferred from generation to generation. I bring the topic of ecstatic sonic practices performed by Indians mainly because they were viewed and racialized as sorcery or forms of what is called in the Caribbean as obia. And obia became a multicultural term understood by Afro-Caribbeans as well as Indo-Caribbeans. So it wasn't necessarily associated religious practices for those racial groups. It certainly became a well-known stigma. The literature has brought the emergence of discourse led by Indo-Guyanese Americans, which emphasizes Madrasi sonic practices as having an ancient Tamil origin. Throughout, we find Madrasi music, although it's ostracized, offers people a compelling feeling of vibration, a power, and a presence through manifestations. These forms of energy and power are often associated with Shaktiism and Kundalini. There is a cultural fascination as well as we explore sonic dimensions of Madrasi music as a significant part of these religious practices. And also there is a interest to confirm and mediate cultural authenticity, religious authority, as well as distinctions of South Asian American diaspora culture. Further analysis is needed, and especially how we see sonic somatic embodiments of Madrasi music invoking manifestations, the sensations of Tamil diasporic sounds. So there are gaps in literature, and we have yet to expand on anthropological approaches regarding Indo-Caribbean religious practices. Specifically, Madrasi descendant Hindus have encountered prejudice as they came to represent a social category post-colonial era, and also a religious stratification of North-South Indian status, color divisions that existed in South Asia that also assimilated into Guyanese society through generational transmission. When we really reflect on the Mariamman religious traditions, the worship of the mother goddess and other goddess forms, we can trace similarities of those practices to southern parts of India. And we can also reflect on the significance of Tamil speaking diasporas in Singapore, Malaysia, Fiji, Martinique, South Africa. Mariamman worship is really increasing. There's a rise in feminism, so there is also a Western interest in the practices of Shaktiism. And there is a vitality and a vibrancy of Mariamman worship in Guyana as well as in North America. So it does have a different narrative in the future. Kali worship specifically is a characterized worship. So weekly, Hindi deities manifest themselves in the bodies of religious pujaris in order to heal people. On occasions, they are also prescribe acts of devotion that promote healing practices or cure diseases and have physical and spiritual origins. So there wasn't a question of validity of these acts performed by pujaris. There was a faith in the belief of manifestations in the community. Kali devotees are also descendants of Indians living in rural areas of Guyana and self-identify as Hindus. Participation in attendance and puja are also not limited to Hindus. We also found that Muslims, Christians, Afro-Guyanese people have also participated in puja ritual practices. So what we have noticed is that as we look into comparisons between Madrasi Hindus and Sanatan Dharma Hindus in Guyana, we do see a variance of worship and worship practices. So the development of stigmas also were formed where Madrasi Hindus were not viewed as being orthodox in their practices of Hindu rituals. So there are efforts when we think about the details of Madrasi ritual practices and puja. Particularly, a major area of discussion is dialogues about animal sacrifice and how it's extremely common among Kali worshippers for a series of reasons, including the concern of the ethical practices, but also to look into where the practices conform to sacred Hindu writings. This is one major area of concern and of the reasons why there is a stigmatization of Kali worship in Guyana as well as other parts of the Caribbean. But when we look at other stigmas, because of the belief of witchcraft or obya, there are also stigmas that aren't particular to a religious group. It is shared beliefs among multiple groups in the country. So through distinct practices of devotion to deities, men and women have sought to cure themselves of diseases and misfortune to improve their lives, coming to these temples in Guyana. And the rites of Kali and other deities such as Kalbairu, Kateri Ma, Sangani worship are pujas. They're manifestations of the belief and submission to Hindu deities through prayers and offerings. So when we think about the work that's performed by priests and temples through devotees, they do counterbalance the effects of the belief of witchcraft or obya. But the other area of discussion is the significance of manifestations and how they are commonly performed in these pujas. The sonic dimensions of Madrasi music influencing these manifestations are also compelling. The consumption of somatic sensations and compelling of transformative realities are significant when we think of Madras religion and transnational religious identity. But it also brings forth a deeper discussion of Indian identity. There actually is literary work and analysis by Williams on how to better understand the significance of things Guyanese. So to better understand of Madrasi sonic practices, we do need to understand the influence of other factors such as globalization and the inclusion of world religions in our perspective. So as we have and navigate through our discourse, there is a interest in seeking to legitimize the transnational phenomenon that's associated with Madrasi practices and puja and worship rituals. But there are also many members of Sanatan Dharma that see Kali worship as a distorted version of Hinduism. So particularly when we look at the practices of animal sacrifice Many feel that Hindu principles are of nonviolence. So the resilience of such practices is viewed as a distortion. However, not all Kali devotees practice sacrificial rituals. They do offer forms of prasad, fruits, and other various sweets. But it is controversial in present day, and there are many intergenerational gaps that exist, as well as diasporic influences. As a Madrasi Hindu Indo-Caribbean living in New York City, Brooklyn, and Queens specifically, I confirm that these stigmas still exist. The validity of these practices still exists, although we have found that over the last 2 decades, the Madras religion is more evident than ever. Members of Madrasi temples in New York number over 30,000 within the Indo-Caribbean population, and well over 230,000 in North America. Yet, we do find that Indo-Caribbean Mariamman worship in New York City is really characterized by variance across wider religious communities. So when we look into the worship of Indo-Guyanese Kali worship, there is a transnationality when we think about the identity of ancestral spirits and the belief that these worship, these rituals are required to be practiced. It's a generational obligation to continue the practice and the worship of the family. But there are case studies to speak about the relationships of cultures in circulation. When we think about the forms of ancestral spirits and deities and how they make themselves known through manifestations. So there are really much more pieces for us to discover and talk about. I think the discourse has been somewhat stifled because of the stigmas that exist in the community regarding the validity of Hindu Madrasi practices. So when we think about inter and intergroup power relations and assertions of authenticity, then there will be barriers in continuing the resilience of this tradition that exists in Guyana as well as North America. I do look forward to continuing my research, sharing more discussion points. Specifically, Tamil Diaspora has yet to be expanded. Tamil Nadu has a strong family connection for me, as well as many others in the Caribbean. And there is still an inequality that they encounter as a community. When we look at diasporic communities, genocides that just existed just a few decades ago, discourse is still needed. And I also seek to destigmatize the practices of Kali worship in the Caribbean community. Memory is not a stable recollection of the past. It's negotiated, it's changed, it's legitimized within families, but also between groups. So investigating, retelling, recreating family memory can be a process of changing our national history. Untold family memories and family secrets have yet to be discovered, as well as family difficulties. So we do have the ability to change those conversations in our own family, open up the discourse, and also seek to uncover more that changes our own personal narrative and identity development path. I look forward to speaking to you all soon. Take care.